You're listening to the 2018 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers Program. This session features Diana Wichtel in conversation with Elizabeth Knox. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. We're going to have a great session very soon. I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth Knox, who will be having a wonderful conversation with Diana Wichtel about her award-winning book, Driving to Treblinka. My name's Kerry Sunderland. I'm the coordinator of Readers and Writers, and big thank you to Page and Blackmore, our sponsors of the program. You will, of course, be able to buy copies of Diana's book and have a quick chat to her and get her to sign the copy of the book after the session. There will be a little time for questions at the end. And I'm very delighted in asking you to join me in welcoming Elizabeth and Diana. Thank you.
Hello, welcome. It's lovely to be here. This is a very nice space. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, Nelson. Diana Wichtel is somebody whose work I have been reading for years and years. I've always loved her television reviews and her feature articles. She has a voice and a sensibility that it's very rewarding to spend time with. And now this book, Driving to Treblinka, won the non-fiction award at the Ockhams last year and the Best First Book award. Good start.
Very late start.
Yeah. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. Adam Dudding says of Driving to Treblinka, it's conventional when a book is full of horror and sadness to say it's moving, a reviewer's code for omitting you welled up a few times, but Driving to Treblinka goes beyond that. Several chapters are genuinely distressing to read, not just the descriptions of Holocaust atrocities, but also the intimate accounts of how those traumas resonated through the lives of the survivors like Ben Wichtel, and then into subsequent generations. And this is what we're going to talk about. How these things last and also how fleeting and hard to grasp a life is. So, would you like to begin by reading? I think that would be good just to get a flavour of your voice.
Sure. I'd just like first to say thank you very much for having me. I haven't been to Nelson for 40-something years, I think it is. Delighted to be here. And when I was here, it was with a then boyfriend in a clapped out Hillman imp selling psychedelic posters. I hope there's no one here who remembers those posters. So it's really lovely to be back. This is from a chapter called It's Snowing in Vancouver. It's set back in Canada where I was born, and it covers a period just before my mother came back to her family in New Zealand on a sort of rescue mission with her 3 children. The last time I spoke to my father, I was a bitch. By the summer of '64, there were tea stains on the ceiling of our house from the times when my father would smash the table with his fist in a rage. I was 13. One night I was in the upstairs bathroom when he came home and banged on the door, furious, trying to get to his milk of magnesia. I have stomach cancer. He was suffering from a few things by then, I would discover, but not that. Maybe it was what his father, Jacob Joseph Wichtel, merchant of Warsaw, had died of in 1928, leaving Rosalia and their 7 children to face what he couldn't possibly have foreseen, because who could? I must have told the kids at school that we were going to New Zealand before the summer holidays in June, because I can remember Paul Zalewski saying, "You'll be eaten by the Mau Mau." My mother's family in Auckland sends us copies of the New Zealand Herald. I have the ghost of a memory that the newspapers were sent so that my father could look for jobs. The television page of the Herald reveals one channel that comes on at 2 in the afternoon and finishes at 10:30 p.m. with a prayer. I flatly refuse to leave, but our life in Vancouver has already ended. In the last 2 months, I stopped seeing my friends. We're as good as gone. We have to get rid of Dukey. My mother puts an ad in the paper. A family comes in their car with their other dogs to get her. We watch her anxiously staring at us out the back window of their car as the people drive away. We weep. My mother, who's survived her own chaotic past by not looking back, doesn't think to get the people's contact details. Dad is furious that Dukie's been taken away, destination unknown, and there's no way of finding out her fate. The phone keeps ringing from the ad. My mother can't talk to the callers because she keeps bursting into tears. I have to take the phone and say the dog is gone. Dukey, I hope you had a good life. In these last months, my father becomes a greyer, shakier, nocturnal, silent presence. He comes home one night with a gash on his head so bad it requires stitching. He says he walked into the edge of a heavy glass door at the bank. The meeting at the bank can't have gone well. We begin to spend more time together watching television. No one is bothering to tell me to go to bed, so I don't. He likes to watch Meet the Press. We start to have late-night talks about philosophy, politics, and religion. We're living in a very conservative Christian neighborhood. I come home spouting what I've been told at school about Jesus, good, and communism, very, very bad. Jesus was a great philosopher, my father says, but he's not the Son of God. And the communists? They aren't the worst thing in the world. During these talks, I learn to admire his mind. Then I go to say goodnight to my mother, and she's crying. Soon we're packing our suitcases, just what we can carry. Dad is to stay behind and crate up our belongings to send to New Zealand. My mother packs nothing of any value. The amethyst brooch that was a gift from her aunt, the hand-me-down mink coat Molly sent from New York, her engagement ring, all have long since been pawned. For some reason, she takes a huge hat box. It won't fit in the overhead lockers and will cause farcical scenes as we get jammed in the aisles of planes. My goldfish is named Dewey after my initials, D-E-W. On our last day, I carried Dewey, sloshing unhappily in his fishbowl, around to Anne's house. I haven't seen much of her over the summer. We promised we'll write, and we do for a while. Recently, Anne tracked me down and came to visit me in New Zealand, trailing traces of that other world behind the closed door. She couldn't remember much about my father. She hardly ever saw him. Always went to her place with its Danish modern furniture and clean-cut blonde parents with normal accents, like a family from television. Her mother enrolled us for charm school. That was a failure. Our ship was going down, and I was learning the ladylike way to get out of a car. I can't remember much about the day we left. When we got to the airport, I felt a little put out when my father paused to put some 50-cent pieces into an insurance machine that promised to pay out if we crashed. He always was a bit of a gambler. I don't remember saying goodbye, just turning to wave when we went through the gate. It didn't feel like a big deal. Dad was going to follow us to New Zealand. We would see him soon. After an eternity, we landed and stepped onto the tarmac to a chorus of yoo-hoo from behind the wire fence. In a photo we have, my mother looks a little deranged and we girls shell-shocked. I'm clutching the wretched hat box. The family had clubbed together to finance the rescue mission that brought us to New Zealand. There was an air of disgrace about the whole enterprise. We were separated for the convoy home through the damp, lush, alien landscape. We girls climbed into the back of Uncle Jim's blue Mini. I'd never seen a car so small it didn't have pedals. What do you think of the scenery, Uncle Jim said. Lovely, I quavered, lighting on the correct answer to any question about how we found our new home. I expected you to be glamorous, but you're just ordinary girls, he said. Maybe in New Zealand that was a compliment. There was a gathering at my grandmother's house to greet us. Other than funerals, I would never again see so many of our relatives together. My great-aunt Alma was small and perfectly square. She said, hooray, when she meant goodbye. Also, we're a mad lot, and, encouragingly, it's a great life if you don't weaken. 4 months later, it's Christmas. We're living in a tiny prefab beside my grandmother's house, one road back from Milford Beach. My father phones. Come back, Diana, he says. It's snowing in Vancouver. I say, how can we come back? Mum's working 6 days a week. We don't even have enough money to buy shoes. My mother takes the phone away. I was 14, angry, a bitch. He knows how much I love the snow.
I'm very struck by that, that it seems like a disgrace, that it's a defeat. But we often are made to feel defeats as disgraceful or shameful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. That's a recurring theme, now that you've made me think about it, throughout this story. One of the things that was very unbearable to read when we got some information about what happened to my father after we left, because contact broke down, was his sense of failure. It was very hard to realise, because we'd kind of been told, made to believe, led to believe that he had gone completely insane and was beyond any reach. But at a very late stage, I had to realise that wasn't the case, and that that was one of the things he was feeling.
Yes. And yeah, it's just general in society that we are encouraged to feel ashamed of our breakdowns and defeats and everything.
And particularly in those days when there was no acknowledgement of trauma or any, the things that people went through.
The book deals very well with your culture shock coming to New Zealand. I was wondering whether the slow demotions from one neighbourhood to another, but as you became poorer and more straitened circumstances in Vancouver, whether any of those dislocations would have in any way kind of shielded you against the great culture shock of New Zealand, or was it just sort of immense?
Well, I think it was immense, partly because we'd had no family. My father was a Polish Jew who'd ended up in Canada after the war. My mother, a Kiwi girl on her OE, who'd ended up working for him, and within a very short space of time was pregnant and married in that order. Because he was 10 years older, he'd been through the Holocaust, he'd lost everything and everyone, and he wasn't messing around by that point, so it all happened. And I think so that suddenly we had this gigantic family, full of its own secrets, and we were living in a tiny little prefab. Yeah, the actual demotion aspect of it didn't actually strike me, except I do recall having to go to school, like the relatives had to buy everything, our uniforms, everything, and I know my mother found it humiliating, and I sort of took that on board at a certain level, but and obviously I was angry about that.
But you were quite a sophisticated teenager in Vancouver, and suddenly you're in this really quite, you have your kind of your burgeoning womanhood sort of slightly taken away from you. You had nylons and lipstick and sophisticated television, and suddenly you have to kneel on the floor and to have your hem measured to make sure that your knees aren't. I suppose your knees were allowed to show, but it had to be on your knees.
No, they weren't.
They weren't.
No,
that's
right.
No
knees.
I think it climbed up several inches by the time I was kneeling on the floor, sometime in the 70s. That allow, what was it, sort of this much.
We broke that ground.
Yeah.
We used to roll up our rompers into hot pants. But rompers, what the actual, are these things that we had to wear? It was unbelievable. But but I must say though, the story isn't really, it inevitably is my story, because I felt if I was going to expose everyone else, I had to also write about myself too. At the risk of self-indulgence, because I was talking about my parents who were dead and unable to reply. But, I do think there was also a release of tension, because there was a lot of social pressure at a Canadian high school. You were supposed to be being invited to the basketball game on Friday night and all that kind of stuff. And, there was, in those days, bouffant hairdos at dawn, who could be the highest and the biggest. And I wasn't very good at all that. So in a way, getting into the uniform, while I still have nightmares about coming to school in the wrong uniform, there was a certain release of social tension.
Yes, that enforced the egalitarianism of old New Zealand. It was,
yeah.
Yes, it was quite something. Your initial loss at that point, where you came to a new country and sort of, had this dislocation of yourself, that sort of obscured the loss of your father, because you were told that he was going to join you later?
Yeah, It was when I look back now, it was a sort of frog boiling in the water situation, you know? Everything happened so slowly and gradually that you didn't really question it. You know, he was going to come, he was going to pack everything up, and there was contact to begin with. Then the letters got strange. He seemed to think we were living with his relatives in New York, and I couldn't understand that. And then, as far as I understood, he stopped contact with us, and that I don't think is how it actually happened, but that's how I understood it. And maybe, you know, one thing the book's about is how you build up a narrative from what's available that is easy, that you can live with, basically. And it took me a surprising number of decades to suddenly get the realization that, in fact, he'd lost everything twice. He'd had everything taken from him twice. He'd been abandoned twice. And his death was like the death of those of his family who didn't survive. In that respect, it left no trace. So it took me a long time to put all that together, and I can see now it was easier to believe that he had somehow withdrawn from us for one reason or another.
And then when you were 19, when you heard that he was in a mental hospital at that point, or that he died in a mental hospital. Yeah.
Well, we did hear from my mother because she had, I mean, this is how things played out. You know, it was just, we told all our friends at school, where's your father? Because no one didn't have a father in those days unless there was some obvious reason. And we would say, well, he's coming from Vancouver. And they would, oh, you know, is he still coming? Yes. And then eventually my mother, what are the odds, met a man from Vancouver at Bisthew Wine and Spirits in Takapuna, where she was working. And he moved in. And so everyone was saying, oh, this is your father from Canada. No. And I mean, it was just, so I think at that point, I just thought, right, you know, I moved out of home at 17 and just got on with trying to,
Live life, yeah.
And I think survival, you know, in that sense, you know, I think I don't judge my mother harshly for maybe allowing us to think certain things, because she was trying to survive as well. And I knew her last few years in Vancouver had been very, very hard. She was on the brink herself of going under. So I didn't judge her harshly, but as my brother and I have talked about it and said we wish that she'd let us know we could have written, you know, things like that.
Yes. Presumably she would have been getting letters.
Well, yes, because at that point when we did hear finally he was in a mental hospital, she must have been, well, she was in touch with him because she wanted to marry Stu, who she'd met in Auckland, because he was going to Japan. He was an airline navigator, and they were supposed to be married for her to go along in those days. And so she had sent off for a divorce.
Yes. But were there any surviving letters of
No.
whatever? That's right, so yes.
Yes.
So.
And years later, when I finally sat down with her and asked her what had gone on, I said, there must have been correspondence. And her cousin, John, who was a lawyer, was helping her. So I rang him, and he dutifully checked the old files, but there was nothing there. I think he was just helping her casually, really. And she told me she'd thrown everything out. She couldn't bear it. It was too painful for her. Mm. And that's another thing that comes up, I think, in my book and in other people's stories, is that when parents do what they need to do to survive, they're actually cutting their children off from their history too sometimes. So, you know, I know she just couldn't face it. And whenever we talked about it, she'd cry.
Yes, well, you say it's very difficult to ask questions of someone who's crying, which is one of the great problems of coming to write a book about trauma, you know, sort of historical trauma, and you have people who are more as involved like you were, and people who are more involved like your mother. But how do you push through? I mean, how do you approach that? asking questions that make people cry?
Well, very badly in my case. I think, it was easier. It was clearly easier not to. I mean, we always ask questions. There'd be little bursts of asking questions. But I think for me, and for her, obviously, because she said so, to open that door to that past was a very dangerous thing to do, And until quite recently, when I've met relatives, when I go to pick up the phone, when I've discovered some new relative or make contact, there's this fear about opening that door. Because, in our family, it was always trouble. Things never went well.
Yes.
So I think there's that, you put it away because you're not up to it in a way. But in recent years, I've just sort of gritted my teeth and done it, and it's all been worth doing. But yeah, I think opening that door for years was hard. I'd take a peep, ask a few questions, and then
Close the door.
close the door.
Your father told you what his story, in short, while you were still living with him, and you asked him the wrong question. He said that he was on the train to Treblinka with his mother and his siblings, and they'd come from the Warsaw Ghetto, which had been dissolved as in people had been murdered left and right, and they were the remnants who were being sent off to what wasn't even a concentration camp, it was an extermination camp that, it was just a sort of the industrial process of doing away with people. And he was very thin and he could get out. So he squeezed through a window.
Yes.
And you asked him, and he told you that, and your question was?
Well, I just said to him, how could you leave your mother on the train? Because to me, as a little kid who was very close always to my mum, I just couldn't imagine doing that. When you're a little kid, your mother's your life. And I knew he had a picture of his mother beside his bed, not that he talked about it a lot, but it was a terrible question to ask, but you didn't realize it at the time. And I don't remember him minding, but this was the point at which my mother would always say, don't upset your father, and change the subject. So we would talk a little in fits and starts, but I remember she was always very, out of the best of motives, I'm sure, trying to shut it down again. But I think that's also more general, I've come to realize in the reading I've done. I think Lawrence Rees, who's written a book on the Holocaust recently, was a BBC broadcaster, interviewed lots of survivors over the years, and he said, yes, certainly some didn't want to talk about it, and some did. It was just that other people didn't really want to listen. They couldn't handle it. So I think in his case, when I think back to the little bits he told us, he did want to talk about it.
Yes, but the opening remarks were sometimes so hard to ask a follow-up question. Like you were watching a television program.
Yes.
About something, and he said that he saw Nazis shooting a woman's breasts off, is what he said. And then how does the child, hearing that, follow up with a question?
Yes, well, actually, that was in the backyard, and he never let us have guns, but of course we pestered and pestered until we had our Roy Rogers and Dale Evans 6-shooters. And my little brother got a much easier ride. He was a lot younger, and so my father bought him quite a realistic-looking rifle. And I remember my father picking it up and sort of looking down the sights and just casually almost remarking that. And my mother, Ben, don't talk about that. So once again, I think we would just take... the thing is, I remember every time he said something like that, it was burnt into my mind.
Yes. Well, it's that you saw the world the way that you were meant to see the world as a school child in Canada and so forth. And every so often you get a glimpse that your father must see the world very differently. But then he isn't there to ask all the questions when you're actually ready to ask them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why, even though it took me decades to do anything very practical about all of this. I think I was always trying to figure him out. I was always storing these things away and trying to make sense of them all the way through. But because it never added up and because he disappeared, once again, you put it aside and try and just get on with. Our family was so fragmented and such a mess anyhow. It was a pretty day-to-day struggle to get by. Yeah, didn't leave a lot of energy for anything else.
So what brought you to this book? So how did this book come about?
Well, there were a few things that happened, but the first thing that happened, it was just breaking down some barriers that I suppose I wasn't even consciously aware of. But my partner, Chris, got the Wolfson Fellowship, which is a journalism prize, very nice, which sends you to Cambridge University in England for 3 months to write about, in those days, whatever you wanted, really. And he was a journalist, but also with an architecture background, so he was wanting to look at how architecture was written about in the mainstream press in New Zealand, which was hardly at all. While we were over there for 3 months, we were doing a bit of traveling, and he said, we should go to Poland. And I was like, oh yeah, well, maybe. And he said, no, we should go to Poland. And I said, oh, no, you haven't got time. You've got. But he got very interested through my story, I suppose, my father's story, the architecture of murder and memorial. And there's no better place to look at that than Poland, really. So in the end, he said, we're going to Poland. So we went. And I remember getting off the plane and actually having trouble stepping down there. It had obviously, it was a place that I had built up some fears about, I suppose, or paranoias and things.
They murdered your relatives.
Well, they did. There was,
Well, or they stood by.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, the Nazi, I have to always be very clear about this. Treblinka was a Nazi death camp in Poland, and there were more Poles who were what they call righteous Gentiles who saved Jews than in any other country. It was also the country where they killed the most Jews. And there were also pogroms and people handing in Jews, so it was both sides of the coin there. And when I go to Poland, I find that history hasn't been addressed there very well, and as we've seen in recent times, not at all.
No, they're sort of dialing that back. They're not teaching it in schools. But tell us about Krakow and the former Jewish district and what they were selling in the shops.
Yes. Well, we were looking, where will we stay? And in Krakow there was Kazimierz, which was the Jewish quarter before the war. And you could stay in a hotel that had a mikvah, which is a ritual Jewish bath, and it was in an area where you could eat Jewish food and do all that. And we thought, oh, that will be nice, And I hadn't really thought a great deal about it. So we went and stayed there, and it was the most unsettling experience, really, because there were all these old shops with the names of the people who'd owned them, and, wonderful menus which said, imagine the romance of those times. You can sit at the very sewing machine where this man used to do his work. And, I kept turning over the pages to see what had happened to these people whose names were up there, and there was no mention at all of that. And if you asked any questions, you always just got this, what I came to feel was like shutter going down, I don't know, or, I said, do Jewish people own this place? No.
Not now, yes.
No, but no one wanted to talk about it. We didn't ask many questions because we were a bit shell-shocked and stunned. But in the gift shops, too, there were these little figurines you could buy, which were little figurines of Jews, like Orthodox Jews, or Jews with money bags. And I was like to Chris, this can't be right. What is this? And so I did a bit of reading about it, and other people, of course, have delved into it. And it's a question of whether it's nostalgia for this community that once lived there or anti-Semitism. And I think it's a bit of both myself. But and some people have called it Jurassic Park because... but it's also very popular because, and I was drawn to it because it is, for all the weirdness of it, it was a place where I felt some closeness to what a place might have been like that my family had lived in. And then we went to Warsaw and drove to Treblinka. And so the whole thing was a very surreal experience.
Yes.
But I think once I'd done that, I did come back and with great difficulty, only under sort of the huge pressure of you must do this for a deadline, wrote a travel story about it, in which I referred obliquely a little bit to the family history, but it wasn't, well, I did refer to it, but I didn't go into it a huge amount.
And that was the beginning of this.
Yes. Well, yes, in the sense that eventually Mary Varnum from Our Press had read that, and one other thing that I'd written previously that referred a little bit to about my father for a chapter in a book, a collection, and she said, "You've got a strange family background, do you want to write about it?" And that was it, really.
Yeah, not as good as a wink, kind of thing, yeah.
Well, I think at that point, you see, I thought, well, one day I might write this story down for the family or whatever.
Yes.
But I never thought anyone would want to read it.
Yes, but then you interviewed Daniel Mendelsohn.
Yes. Well, that was once I decided to do the book in a blind panic. Daniel Mendelsohn wrote this book, The Lost. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's a fantastic book. And it's about, he's an American journalist and writer and classicist.
A search for 6 of the 6 million. So he just goes looking for some relatives.
Yes, and they were like great uncle, I think. So they weren't that close. A great uncle and his daughters.
Yes.
And he does this, of course, magnificent quest all over the world and interweaves it with bits from the Torah and things. It's a magnificent book. But I saw the book on our arts and books editor's desk, and I left a note for him, and I said, please, 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 can I interview this man? Because he was coming for a Auckland Writers' Festival. So I did, and, we talked all about his book, but I took the opportunity to ask him a few questions about this sort of a quest. And he's a brilliant man, and so, I mention him in the book because the things he said were really formative to how I went about it. He said, it can't be about your personal growth.
Yes, that's right.
What I got out of the Holocaust will not do either.
This book is not about personal growth.
And he also, his advice was you have to open the door to the past knowing you're not going to close it again, and you have to put yourself in the stream of history. You'll be amazed what happens. And I've thought of that a zillion times since. And it changed how I thought about the past. Instead of this thing back there with the shut door, I just see it now as something that's still flowing alongside of you, and you can dip into it at various points. And I don't mean it any woo-woo kind of way, because I have no beliefs like that at all. But I just believe it's a dynamic relationship you have with it. It's not... It changes the whole time.
And you started writing the book, and then you were pursuing leads, but also things came to you. Somebody said, "Oh, you should go and ask."
Yes.
And relatives you didn't know you had, like your father's cousin Joe.
Yes.
Yes. So
that's right. For some reason, and typically in our family, I was in touch with my 2 New York cousins who were the children of my father's brother, Cy. He left in 1933 and went to America and became a very wealthy man and had 2 children. And over the years, we've been fitfully in touch. Again, we all found it difficult, I think, and we'd get in touch, but then we wouldn't for years. But I was in touch with them, and we happened to be traveling, so I went there. We went there, and I think it was 2006. Was it as recently as that? And on the last day we were in New York, one of my cousins said, we have another cousin. And I said, what? Because there's nobody, there's so few of them left. And she said, yes, Cousin Joe, he's our father's first cousin. My father's Aunt Sabina had left in the 20s and ended up in Brooklyn and had Joe and 2 other children. And so I rushed home, got this, we were supposed to be packing and leaving in first thing in the morning, and I rang him, and it was the most extraordinary thing, hearing his voice. And he was wonderful. He's died since, unfortunately, but he was a lot older than me, but he was the family historian. He'd been teaching about the Holocaust throughout his retirement, and he was a total force of nature. You could not disagree with him, or, he would say, Diana, you cannot be angry with your father. And I said, I'm not angry, Joe. You know?
It's like, I say you're angry, you're
you
angry.
cannot be angry with your father. But he had been there when the survivors came back. So he was a 17-year-old boy when my father came to his aunt's house, and it all went horribly wrong. So I heard why this little fragments of the family couldn't.
Yeah, tell us about why it all went horribly wrong.
Well, I've got Joe's version, and I've got, I suppose, some of my own ideas about it. But according to Joe, my father arrived with a guitar. He was a very musical man, looking like he didn't have a care in the world and looking rather bohemian. He was not a religious man. In fact, he was a pretty devoted atheist. But they'd all been brought up in a very religious household, and my Aunt Sabina didn't take this at all well, and he didn't conform to what they thought he should look like.
As a Holocaust survivor, yes. And he had been through, the timeline of your father was the ghetto, so all through the time when they were living on, I think you gave the figure for how many calories people were living on a day on average was something like 600 or...
Oh, even less. I forget the exact number.
About that, which is not really enough to get out to look for food, not enough energy to look for food.
No. And when we saw the first films, I asked him, we were sitting there together because it was, there was lots of stuff about the war, but there was very little about the Holocaust for a long, long time.
Yes.
But there was some footage from the Warsaw Ghetto, and I remember saying to him, but what was it like to be there, and he just said, you'd wake up in the morning and the person next to you was dead. I remember him saying that. He didn't say a lot more, and I probably was just stunned.
And the person next to him would have probably been one of his siblings.
Yeah, or his grandmother, who we know died in the ghetto. Through Joe, I found out she died in the ghetto. She gave what little ration she had to the younger ones. And that was...
And then he gets put on the train, he escapes from the train, isn't shot.
And the other thing I realised too, I thought, wonderful, he escaped from the train. But that was not a simple matter either. And I've come to, through my reading, to know that, Joe told me people helped push him out. So, but there was also this thing just from reading accounts where you're with your family, you're leaving them to their fate, really. And by then he would have known what the fate was. People going to Treblinka survived an average of 2 hours. They were just stripped of their belongings, harried along, because if they made them run, they died quicker.
Yes, because they were breathing hard once they got in with the poison gas. Yeah. It's just the sort of the logical planning, the sort of logistics that people have gone through to work out how efficiently to murder people.
Yeah. So he would have known, but that doesn't make it a simple decision to leave your family.
No.
So, I think that's the thing of everything you think you know not turning out to be right,
Yes. And then he was out there in the woods with the partisans.
Yes. And he spent a lot of his time in a bunker under the ground. That's where, they were hunted like animals the entire time. He was with partisans. I said to Joe, did he fight? Because he was a young man still. And he said, of course he fought. He had to fight. So I don't know what he did. But I imagine he would have had to. He had to eat. He had to survive. So he never talked about that much, except he did talk about being in the forest he jumped with someone else, but whether they were still together, because you jump and then whether they were still together, I don't know, but he talked about being in the forest and meeting a couple of young German soldiers and putting their hands in their pockets to pretend they had guns, and trying to be threatening. But these very young guys were just as terrified as they were, he said, and they became kind of friends, and they brought them food. And so he'd tell us those stories that were the less horrific ones, I suppose.
Yeah, but slightly more puzzling too, if he's known these people to be terrible, and then he meets some representatives who are kind of just helplessly sympathetic, because that's where they are.
But he always had that. I mean, I think that drove my mother crazy because my mother had a more black and white view of these things. He had German friends, and non-Jewish German friends in Canada. And she's like, how can you have German friends, But the only real bitterness I heard him express was against his fellow country people who didn't help or who, like, they were in the underground and they couldn't get guns. They would arm the non-Jewish fighters, but not the Jewish fighters. So there's a lot of, and you could just as easily be killed by some other partisan group.
Yep.
As you could by the enemy. So, to be hunted by the enemy is one thing, to be hunted by your own people is a different matter.
And then he turns up with your Aunt Sabina's with his
Yeah.
guitar and his jocular manner, and
Yes.
they don't understand.
That maybe he was having a brief moment of happiness to be alive.
And to be
in
with his relatives.
The point something of 1% people, and to have found somebody alive in the world, because there were 100 of them, and they were all gone. 3 survived from that family of over 100, the big extended family on both sides. So the Janisch family and the Wichtel family were annihilated. There's no records, almost no records of any of them.
No, it's quite, there's a at the front of the book there's a family tree which really says it all, just.
But just on that point, my Uncle Si offered him a job, and he was a wealthy man at that stage. He'd made a lot of money throughout the war with contracts and things, and had tried to get his mother out, had tried to, and failed. So that you can imagine the guilt, the survivor's guilt, the various. And my father just didn't want to do it. So he took off to Canada, and they could never understand why he did that. And there was very little contact after that between the families.
He would have. Do you think it would have been the habit of independence by that time, or just the habit of moving?
Partly, but I think it's also judgment.
Yeah.
You see, that's the other thing people sometimes, I hadn't really thought about. How can a person who survived that come back as anything but a hero, or you've survived the unthinkable? But they were judged often. Like my Uncle Paul was one of the 3 survivors. He came back with, he still had a few little diamonds sewn into the hem of his coat. He survived on the Aryan side in Warsaw, hiding out. We've got an account, which some of us is in the book, of his life that Joe had made him write, thank goodness. And, every day there was a brush with catastrophe. He managed to survive. And Sabina, his aunt, said, why didn't you use those to get your mother out? Not understanding that the chances of him still being able to draw a breath were so minute.
Yes.
There was no way that, that was one of the horrors of it, is that it made everyone. I think Paul says in his account, there's no such thing as family anymore. There's just, living for one more day.
Yes. So the story that we have now, there's a lot of talk about trauma and there's a lot of talk about choices and personal accountability that we have, particularly in our kind of social policies towards people less fortunate than us. How does thinking about the tenuousness of luck and chance, rather than making the right decisions, in the story of your relatives, how does that make you think about, the way that people talk about making the right decisions in our own lives now?
Yes, well, I think I'm totally allergic to this idea that you can control everything, and whatever you think, the universe owes you a BMW if you think the right thoughts. I just hate all that. Or even these thoughts that you give yourself illnesses and things, because when you ask the question, well, what about all those people who were slaughtered in the Holocaust? What did they do? What was the error in their thinking?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Which
So,
advice did they not listen to?
Yeah, I think we like to feel we can have control over things, but one of the most fiendish things about what happened there was that every decision you made or didn't make, every action you took or didn't take, could be life or death.
Yes, and you couldn't say at any particular decision what was the right one. It was just
And we're still dealing with the repercussions. The movies are coming out now. I think, Hannah Arendt was quite judgmental about the Jewish councils in the ghettos. Because another fiendish thing they did was to say, here, guys, you can run this ghetto. You decide who goes to the camp. Otherwise, we'll come in and we'll do it, and it'll be even worse. To give people those choices. And people judge people harshly, because there was like Runkowski, in the Warsaw Ghetto, who, it is horrific when you read about it. He had to make a speech to his people in the ghetto. And the speech was, give me your children. Give me all the children up to the age of 9, and I'll be able to save the ones 10 and above. Yes. And of course, there was people committing suicide, people doing all sorts of things. And he's been harshly judged, and it's almost impossible not to, because in the Warsaw Ghetto, Cherniakov, faced with the same requirements, killed himself rather than to do it. But my view is always, you are talking about a world you cannot even imagine. These people have no recourse to justice, law, help, food, air, just about, So they are making decisions in this sphere that we simply cannot imagine. And you'd like to think you'd do the brave thing or the...
It's just a curse to be in the position to make that decision, but...
And he sounded monstrous because, he was riding around in a cart and like he was the emperor of the ghetto, but he ended up in Auschwitz. Some people say he was just murdered there as per usual, and some say people from the ghetto murdered him.
Then this is...
They can make the judgment, but I don't think it's for me to make the judgment.
No. Well, I think that this is one of these subjects where there will be no settled judgment for centuries.
Yes.
If we have centuries.
Yeah.
Yes. But the other thing that comes up in this book is whether the idea of inherited trauma, whether it's kind of familial trauma by the sort of the mysterious silences and absences of a traumatized parent, or there's even a theory about DNA.
Yes, I'm no expert at all, but it was interesting to me to see, it's the field of epigenetics.
Yeah.
And I think it was like there were experiments with birds that a generation of birds would react with fear to something they've never experienced but previous generations had. So how does this get transmitted? And I'd always had a sort of instinctive feeling that that's true. I remember I just felt that some things are passed to you at a cellular level. Because, you think back to your parents, and I know I've dealt with anxiety and panic attacks and all that kind of stuff. And I look back and I realize my father was too. Some of his rages were to do with finding himself, on one occasion, having to drive home through the forest in the dark when we were all late, and he was furious at everyone. And he didn't like picking up the phone, he didn't like answering the door, And so these things are absorbed through, as you say, both, I think. But I think it's interesting to me. I remember I had Richard Dawkins on the phone talking to him, and he is an expert. So I took the opportunity again to say, what do you think about the transmission of trauma? And he was a bit dismissive. He said, I think it happens possibly for a generation or two, but it's not a permanent change. Yes. That's what his view was. But it's still an unfolding field. And it certainly was interesting because it was kind of what I instinctively felt, that you absorb some of this through environment, but also at a sort of cellular level through your parents' experiences.
But also there's a sort of mythic dimension. So tell us, my last question before I let people here ask questions is, tell us about the game that you and your sister used to play with your father.
Right, yeah. Well, that's another of the things you look back on. And, the first time I ever wrote about any of this was when a friend of mine from the Auckland second generation group, they're people of my kind who have a parent or parents who survived the Holocaust. And they were putting together a cookbook of all things. And the idea was that you'd write some memories around food. And I had my mother's cheesecake to write about. But when it came to writing about my father, I just froze, And I remember Deborah Knowles, dear, dear friend of mine who's just died, she rang me up and she said, where's your story? And I said, I can't do it. I just simply cannot write. I can't remember anything. It's no good. Just go ahead without me. And she said, well, what do you remember? And she sat on the phone for probably an hour and a half. And after we'd finished, I sat down and had it to her the next day, I think. And that was one of the things that I remembered, was that he would come home from work late. We'd always eaten and everything first. And I remember in the winter, sometimes we'd make him go out again the back door, and we'd sort of I'd fluff off his hair and turn up his collar and make him look like my idea of a homeless wanderer. And we'd let him in and bring him to the table, which my mother had always set beautifully with his solitary glass of whiskey and hors d'oeuvres and things. And it was just hugely pleasurable for some reason. And that was what I thought about when I finally had to write about it. And years later, well, recently, I looked online, as you do, Googling Wichtel and always trying to find if there's any new information. And there was a professor in England of trauma, and he'd taken that story and used it for an article and in a book. I didn't know anything about it, but and he said what was going on there was my father was sharing his story and giving me a gift, because if you don't share with your child, the child is left disconnected and feeling kind of that there's something that you're not, you can't have the relationship.
He is letting you welcome him into the home, letting you save him.
And even though we didn't talk a lot, we were sharing that story, and it was one of the most comforting things that happened in the whole process of writing the book.
It's just a beautiful story, yeah. So, does anyone have any questions? I've got one last reserved question, which I rather like, so, but if anyone, please.
It was something that you've just hinted about in the book, but I was very interested to know if your sister's experience, because she was a little bit older, is different from yours and her memories.
Yes. And, you know, I think that's been something that I and lots of people in families have to deal with, is the fact you can grow up in the same family, and in our case 18 months apart, and have completely different experiences. And your narrative is a different narrative from maybe a sibling's or someone else in the family. So, yeah, that's been one of the things. She would have her own things to say about the story, but, you know, I can't speak for her, but that's certainly true, yeah. And it's made me consider how much we construct our narratives out of what we have and what we need and what we can live with.
And whether we're actually constructing our experiences as they happen, that when the thing actually happens and you're there with your sister, what's actually happening to her is almost different.
Yes, actually, that's true. And I think I will certainly say from my side, I've come to understand her side a lot more, because you can get very wedded to your own narrative. And also grandchildren, I'll just quickly mention that. Is that, you know, children and grandchildren, my children have given me back this story in a way that wonderfully disrupts my narrative, because to them, and I realized I was making the same mistakes everyone makes, that my mother made, that I swore I would never make, and not really talked about it to them. Say a little bit, but back off. And once they knew the whole story, because they read the book, you know, my daughter said, you know, so he was in the forest with partisans. That's some Tarantino shit, you know. He was a badass. And I thought, yes, he was.
That's exactly right.
And so instead of this crushing, nothing but crushing agony of the story and sadness, which still is there, it doesn't take it away, but there's also that he is inspiring that generation who have gone to his grave, who have said beautiful words over it, which I've included in the book, and who are absolutely fierce about keeping his memory alive. So, yeah, that was very...
Anyone? Yep, you over here.
Hi, I think one of the things that struck me was that it was like putting a jigsaw together, and that there wasn't a lot of information, and sometimes it was just the kindness of people that you were ringing, like maybe at the cemetery, that actually played a really pivotal role in helping you kind of uncover some information. So, yeah, just wondered if you could say something about that.
Yeah, that's so true. I was constantly firing off emails. Is there any sign that and we're always getting back the information saying, sorry, versions of your father never existed as far as we're concerned. And, it happened time and again. But when we did connect with certain people at archives, somebody else who's died recently is my brother-in-law, Jim, who was a lawyer, and he pointed me in the direction of certain archives. And some of the people there were just spectacularly helpful. They would go the extra mile and give me more than I asked for, really. Without their help and I think it would have been so disheartening. And also, I'm a really crap genealogist, so I really needed the help. And it was, very, very heartening and wonderful, the people I've encountered, even the people, yes, at the cemetery, as you say, at the cemetery in Warsaw and one in Canada, who were remarkably good. Even if it was putting a ribbon on a rubbish bag, it was wonderful.
Did you ever go to the mental hospital where he died?
Yes. Yeah, we did. It's no longer, there's a big old creepy building, which I went with my brother and his daughter and my partner, Chris, and we drove up to this building where, it's as people left it when they walked out. It was one of the spookiest experiences of my life. Next door, there's a forensic unit where there are mass murderers, but the building itself is no longer there. We talked to a guy, my brother did, at the forensic unit where these mass murderers are, and he said, the guy, they come out and help me sometimes in the garden, but you wouldn't want to turn your back on them. Anyhow, yes, we did see it, and again, the different reactions were amazing. Like my niece, it's a beautiful place with trees, a creepy old building. She imagined her grandfather sitting on the veranda and looking at the trees and maybe getting some comfort, whereas for me, of course, it was just a place of horror, really. And the guards came while we were there, the security came to see what on earth we were doing, and said they'd had break-ins. Who would want to break in there? I think, most people associated with that building would be wanting to break out, not in.
Yeah. Guerrilla movie making, probably.
Probably.
Yeah.
We have one more up the back here. So
I gather you watch a bit of television. Can you imagine anyone picking up your story for perhaps doing a documentary or a movie?
I think it would be quite difficult because it's sort of so many different places these days. It would cost too much, probably. I did have one guy ring me up, but it was kind of like, I haven't got any money, but... Well, neither have I. But it's sort of hard to imagine, really, but who knows?
We got time for one last question. There's one up the front here.
Do you have what would be your response to people who continue to this day to believe that the Holocaust was a fabrication?
Blind rage, probably, as you can imagine. Yes. I mean, that's one of the downsides of the internet. You can go down that particular rabbit hole, and it's the most depressing place on earth to be. And of course, I followed David Irving and that movie, which I thought was a very good movie on the subject.
Continues to have profile.
I know. It's really, really distressing. And New Zealand also had the case of a master's student. I think the master's thesis is still sitting in Canterbury University, the only university on earth probably to give an A+ to a work of that kind. I mean, yeah.
It was a bit of a black mark on Canterbury University, that one. Yeah.
And I mean, it's easy enough to think they're a bunch of idiots, but the truth is, David Irving isn't an idiot. There's something else going on. He's a smart man. There are a lot of, I can tell when we've occasionally had mail. My partner's written about concentration camps and things, and we get this mail, and you can tell it's just incredibly detailed screeds trying to prove you're wrong, you know? You can tell within a minute what angle they're coming from. Yeah, it's the weirdest thing, but it's like climate change denial. There are people who deny that the AIDS virus exists. It's a mental thing, and I'm not sure exactly what it's about. But yeah, and you know, it's easy enough to laugh it off, but these days less easy at the moment, because in the days of fake news, anti-science, it's more worrying, I think, now. Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful session, and thank you very much for the wonderful book. And Diana will be signing over here, and please do get your copy of the book signed. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Diana.
Thank you.